Boldwood presents Home Sweet Home in Brambleton, written by Fay Keenan and read by Frances Butt. Chapter 1. Ouch! Bella West rubbed at the livid scratch on her right wrist, wishing she'd worn a longer-sleeved top. They were a prerequisite when dealing with the cats, especially the one sitting unrepentantly in front of her, regarding her with wary green eyes. All right, you win. Bella tucked the pet brush back into the apron she was wearing. I'll leave it for today. She'd been trying to give Monty, the ill-tempered and geriatric Bengal, a brush since he was looking a bit scruffy, but Monty, clearly keen to keep his fur as he wanted it, had other ideas. I still love you, though, you old bugger. Reaching out a tentative hand, Bella ruffled the top of Monty's head. The cat, relenting, bumped against her palm as if in apology. This was part of the job she didn't mind in the slightest. The affection from the residents made all the scratches worthwhile. Bella had been working at the Purrfect Paws Cattery and Rescue Sanctuary for about a year, and it was the happiest she'd been in a long time. This job, in addition to the 4 nights a week she worked at the local pub, the Star and Telescope in the village of Lower Brambleton, meant that she could afford the cost of the room in her friend Marika's house nearby. Caring for the residents of Purrfect Paws, some of whom as rescues would go on to new homes, and others who came in while their owners went on holiday, gave her a focus that she'd often lacked in her 31 years on this planet. It wasn't that she didn't have motivation, merely that she liked variety in her life, and while the past year had seen her staying put in one place, the cats coming through the doors of Purrfect Paws were always a challenge. Some trusted you immediately, others, like Monty, took longer. She had found she liked to earn that trust, and, for the most part, she and Monty were beginning to bond, random scratches notwithstanding. That's better. Bella began to hum under her breath, and then the humming turned to low singing. Monty looked at her quizzically. Okay, so I'm a bit rusty. Don't give me the judgy face. She ran a hand down his back. He was slightly skinny now, but at 18 years old that wasn't surprising. His tail flicked up and curled around her hand as she stroked it too. The spots on his back, typical of a Bengal, were a darker brown, and Bella knew they were replicated on his belly. But since Monty was definitely not one for belly rubs, unless you actually wanted more scratches, she hadn't seen much of them. Poor Monty, Bella murmured. It's been, 8 months now? You must be wondering what on earth's going on. Monty was a boarder at the centre rather than a rescue, but in some ways his future was as uncertain as the abandoned cats that Purrfect Paws took in with depressing regularity. His enclosure, the biggest one, had a generously sized catio, a space for fresh air and climbing that he could access via the flap, but it was no substitute for the garden he'd been used to. In sadder moments, Bella wished she could adopt Monty herself, but that was impossible. Her friend and landlady, Marika, lovely as she was, wouldn't be too happy, since Marika's long-term boyfriend Gerard was seriously allergic to cats. Gerard could only just cope with staying the night in the cottage with the aid of antihistamines because of the cat fur that Bella brought back on her clothes after a shift at Purrfect Paws, so adopting Monty was out of the question. Instead, she made sure she spent lots of time with him, even if on occasion his gratitude was in short supply. Well, I'll see you later, she said, as she ambled to the door. Don't bite anyone. Monty narrowed his eyes at her, then turned around and gave her the full benefit of his back view. Charming, Bella muttered. She always made sure that Monty was her last stop on the cattery side. She liked him the most of all the residents, precisely because she'd had to earn his affection. Her next stop, after thoroughly washing her hands to prevent cross-contamination between the sections of the centre, was to check in on the rescue pens. It was more likely that illness could be spread from the often very ill rescue cats to the boarders, but the owner of the sanctuary, Molly Wakefield, had put clear procedures in place to limit the spread either way. Purrfect Paws was the largest hub within 30 miles for stray and abandoned cats, and while they were always busy, the benefit was that they could also rehome their inmates fairly quickly. The summer season meant more kittens, and there were currently 4 from the same litter housed in a large hutch with their mother, who was barely more than a kitten herself. Bella let herself in and played for a while with the kittens, after refreshing their food and sorting out their litter trays. She was pleased to see they'd all grown since they'd been brought in a couple of weeks back, and Clover, their mother, was also looking healthier. Hopefully they'd all find homes soon. "Do you want a cuppa, love?" Molly's cheerful voice drifted through from the reception and office space that separated the 2 sides of the building. "I've just put the kettle on." "Thanks, Moll. That would be great." Bella heard the kettle going on and reckoned she had about 5 minutes to spend with the kittens and the other inmates before a well-earned cup of tea and a biscuit. Some of the residents, like Clover and her little family, were affection-starved and very receptive to cuddles and attention. It was easy to lose an hour with them, and Bella always hoped that when they were rehomed, cats like that would get the love and attention they deserved. Others, like Monty and the petulant Persian Ermintrude, were more aloof, but on their terms, affection was greatly appreciated if they were in the mood. After checking in on the single cats in their pens, Bella wandered back down the corridor to the office and reception. She had a shift at the pub tonight, and was back here tomorrow morning to do the breakfast round, so she knew she needed to make sure she ate well. A biscuit or 2 might keep her going until she got home, but she ran through a mental checklist of what she'd left on her shelf in the fridge, and hoped Marika, who had a tendency to pinch her food if she came in late, hadn't appropriated her lasagna. "Everything all as it should be?" Molly asked as she handed Bella her tea and slipped her an extra penguin. "They all look good," Bella replied. "Anyone going off to pastures new imminently?" "We've had some interest in the kittens, but this time of year I dare say we'll end up with more to replace them before the week is out." Molly sighed. "We really do need to keep pushing the neutering and spaying message." "We do our best, Moll," Bella replied. "You can lead a horse to water and all that." "I know, but it breaks my heart every time I see a cat like Clover. She should never have been allowed out while she was on heat. When will people learn?" "I'm sure someone'll snap her up soon." Bella smiled sympathetically at Molly. She knew how frustrating it was for her, with what felt like a constant stream of cats coming through the doors. When Purrfect Paws was full, new cats would be put out to local fosterers, but even those places, where willing volunteers looked after cats in their own homes until they could be found their own permanent places to live, were struggling. The cost of living crisis had a lot to answer for when it came to people and their pets. Bella often considered herself to be like one of Molly's waifs and strays. She'd moved in with Marika a year ago, having reconnected with her after a number of years abroad. When she arrived in Lower Brambleton with no particular plans for work, Molly had been advertising for someone to help out at Purrfect Paws. The job at the pub had come soon after, so Bella had found herself working rotating shifts at the sanctuary around her nights at the pub. Over the time she'd been working there, she'd learned a lot about animal behavior, and the behavior of some human beings too, and although it was often emotionally draining, she loved seeing how the cats thrived under Molly's gentle care. It wouldn't be too far a stretch to say that she herself had thrived too. Coming back to the UK after some years working various jobs abroad had been a huge change, and this life was different to the one she'd left behind in Europe, but she had settled well, and, a nomad by nature, had finally felt as though she was putting down some roots. It was a strange feeling, but one she welcomed. As she sipped her tea and chatted to Molly about the latest goings-on in the village, she again felt fortunate that, like the residents in the care of Purrfect Paws, she had fallen on her feet. Chapter 2. Yes, I can see from your perspective how that would make sense. Yes, but... Yes, all right. Look, can I call you back? Noah Hathaway shook his head as he ended the call and tried not to hurl his mobile against the wall of his office in frustration. He was very fond of his brother Mark, but there were limits. And today, before a house viewing that would earn him the best commission he'd had all year if the sale went through, was not the ideal time to be muddying the waters with the inconvenient family stuff. Inconvenient family stuff? Is that what Grandpa's legacy amounts to these days? Leaning back in his chair, Noah tried not to think about it in those terms. He'd adored his grandfather and tried to spend as much time with him as he could before the old man had died 4 months ago. The journey from Noah's place in Fulham to the sleepy Somerset hamlet of Lower Brambleton took just under 3 hours on a good day, and the roads had become as familiar to Noah as his morning commute in the later stages of his grandfather's life. Now Jack Hathaway lay at rest in the village churchyard, he hadn't been back in a while, but like any task he'd been avoiding, he knew he'd have to get around to it at some point. Noah was the only one of his 3 brothers living in the UK, and had been for some years. Their father had died 10 years ago, and their mother had remarried and emigrated to the United States. She had little interest in the estate of the father of her dead husband, and so it had fallen to Noah, Joel, and Mark to manage Jack's affairs after he'd passed. Mark, though well-meaning, had concerns of his own, an unwell wife and 3 small children, among other things, and so, apart from checking in from Toulouse, where he now lived, much of the heavy lifting when it came to their grandfather had been done by Noah, whom Jack had made executor. At the time, Noah had been surprised, but on reflection it had made sense. Joel, the youngest brother, lived and worked in Dubai, and, like Mark, wasn't in the UK enough to oversee things. It was probably just as well. If Joel had been at the helm, things might have been sorted out more quickly, but Joel would probably have rubbed everyone up the wrong way. The bluntness and killer instincts that made him a success in the cutthroat world of international finance didn't exactly endear him to other people. And when Noah had thought about it, he'd realized that it had been himself who'd spent the most time with Jack over the years. Noah had been fine with Jack's decision, and after raising their eyebrows initially, his brothers had too. They'd all get a share of the proceeds from the sale of the house, and they'd already divided up most of their grandfather's possessions equitably. For Noah, being executor had meant a certain amount of control over the situation. It had allowed him to channel the grief he'd been feeling into something productive. But the estate had been taking a lot of time to sort out, and his grandfather's cottage was at the heart of this tangled ball. Noah knew he'd been putting things off, but this last phone call had clarified that. It was time to actually do something. The trouble was he wasn't sure what, and in the end, it wasn't the cottage or the will or the contents of the house that had brought things to a head. It was the bloody cat. 4 months on from Jack's death, and Noah still hadn't had the time to sort out Monty, the one sentient being who'd kept his grandfather from shuffling off this mortal coil for far longer than anyone could ever have expected. Monty, 4 kilograms of Bengal tabby cross with a mind of his own. Monty, the kitten who'd featured in well over half of Noah's life. Monty, the cat who, in his grandfather's lighter moments, he'd joked would inherit everything. Monty, who was now incarcerated in the Purrfect Paws cattery, awaiting a decision on his future, and had been for 8 months. Monty, who had hated Noah on sight 18 years ago, and was unlikely to feel any differently now. Noah sighed. It wasn't that he couldn't afford the bills from Purrfect Paws. He earned a decent salary and was more than happy to keep forking out for the cat, if it meant that he didn't have to think too much about where he was. The problem was that Monty had gone into a bit of a decline since he'd been boarding, and if he didn't make a decision soon about the cat's future, Monty could end up costing him even more money. He'd better get down there this weekend and work out what the options were, he thought, as he tried to focus on the 1,000,001 other things he had to do that day. Clicking into his diary, he looked over the next few days. As the owner of the estate agency, he was used to managing his own time, but he had a lot on at the moment. He had several viewings booked for today, and even more calls to make to chivvy along some sales in progress, as well as more admin and paperwork to do tomorrow for another lucrative potential sale. Travelling to the West Country hadn't been on his list of priorities, but he supposed it would have to be now. Hopefully, he could zoom down, check in on the cottage, work out what the heck to do with Monty, and head back before anyone missed him. It could all be done and dusted by the time he got back to his desk on Monday, or so he hoped. As he clicked out of his diary, though, the rogue thought that handling the complications of his grandfather's estate could be as tricky as handling Monty himself sprang to mind. He hoped against hope that that wouldn't be the case. Chapter 3. The next morning, things weren't looking so good for his grand plan. Noah opened an email that had dropped into his inbox from the firm of surveyors in Somerset while he'd been getting a coffee from the machine in the corner of the office. Not expecting more than a standard Level 2 survey, he was brought up short by the email, and then shorter by the attachment. The survey had detailed several potentially problematic obstacles that Noah and his brothers would need to consider when they put Jack's cottage on the market. These included an issue with the electrical wiring and, more worryingly, the presence of expanding foam insulation in the roof space, which had already caused problems with the damp timbers. If the insulation was not removed, the report went on, then the structural integrity of the roof could be compromised. Sorry, Noah, if you've any hope of achieving the market value for the cottage, some serious work is going to have to be done first, or you'll have to drop the asking price. Even if you did that, with the roof and its timbers in their current state, I doubt it would be mortgageable by a prospective vendor. Noah's heart sank. Shit. That was going to throw the mother of all spanners in the works. Neither of his brothers would be happy with the delay. The two choices he had: put the cottage on the market for a low price and hope someone who didn't need a mortgage snapped it up, or do the rewiring and hire a contractor to strip out the foam insulation around the timbers, would both be expensive. He got the feeling that his brothers would balk at being asked to cough up the money to take out the insulation, but the other choice, risking selling the house for less, wouldn't sit well with them either. It seemed, along with Monty, there was yet another complication. He was also cross that, while his grandfather had kept his paperwork in order on virtually everything, there was no documentation about the cussed spray insulation. Noah hadn't looked in the loft on any of his visits to the cottage after Jack's death, and now he wondered if the company who'd done the job was on the level. As an estate agent, he knew well the depressing preponderance of shady businesses connected to home improvement and house building, and it wouldn't have surprised him if, especially in later years when Grandpa wasn't quite so up with it, Jack had fallen for a cowboy builder's patter. Perhaps that was why there was no paperwork to be found, and why Jack hadn't mentioned he'd had it done. Noah looked at his watch. He had to check in with Ruby and Violet, his 2 salespeople, about the viewings they'd conducted yesterday. There was a friendly competition between them about who could hit their sales targets quickest each quarter, and this time Ruby had pipped Violet to the post. Violet, therefore, had doubled her efforts in July and wasn't showing any signs of slowing down. He tried to put the issues with his grandfather's cottage out of his mind as he went through to the small space that constituted the storefront for Noah Hathaway Estates. Violet was on a call, and Ruby was getting her things together for another viewing, but she paused when Noah came through. "I've just got off the phone with a prospective buyer for 15 Cavendish Road. They love it, but won't go the distance on the full price. Do you think the vendors'll take 10 grand off?" "Worth a try," Noah replied. "Cavendish Road's been on our books longer than anywhere else, so it's worth shifting if you can." "I'll give them a ring this afternoon when I'm back from the viewing in Rotherhithe Street." Ruby smiled. "Any plans for the weekend, boss?" Noah grimaced. "A lot of miles to Somerset and back, but hopefully that won't be for much longer." Noah had been in the office early, and although he'd heard Ruby coming in slightly before 8:30, she hadn't disturbed him, so this was the first chance they'd had to catch up. Ruby gave him a sympathetic look. "Your grandpa's house?" "Yup. Some stuff's come up in the survey that I need to sort out, so I'm heading down there after work." "Well, let me know if you need us to shift anything around. I don't mind taking over for a couple of days if you have to spend some more time down there." "Thanks." Noah smiled at her. "Any news on the Henderson place?" "Not yet, but I'll check in with the buyer this afternoon. It would be good to get that one clinched before the end of the month." "I can do that if you like," Violet chipped in, having wound up her phone call. "That couple who wanted a second viewing on that flat in Berkeley Place just cancelled, so I'm free." "That's a shame," Ruby said playfully. "I guess that'll put me ahead again." "I wouldn't be so sure," Violet replied, grinning. The 2 were good friends despite the competition and relished the chance for banter. "Well, let me know what the outcome is with Henderson," Noah replied. He enjoyed the office atmosphere with his 2 salespeople. The business was small, but getting bigger every day, and a large part of that was down to Violet and Ruby. "Have you got anything on this afternoon, boss?" Ruby asked. "Not yet, but I've got a mountain of paperwork to chase on a couple of sales from last month, so I'm going to spend it behind my desk." Noah gave both women a grin. "Hard work being in charge, you know." "We know. But I will stretch my legs and grab some lunch first, I think. Can I get either of you anything?" A walk through the park opposite the office might help to clear his head, Noah thought, and the cafe at the centre of it did a killer egg mayonnaise on sourdough if you could get there before they sold out. At a snip before 12, he might still be in with a chance. He shouldn't be bunking off work, even for lunch, but if he was going to end up stuck in the office for hours afterwards, it was worth it. He tapped Ruby and Violet's lunch requests into his phone and started out. As he walked, he kept turning over the problems with Jack's cottage again and again. Joel liked to be presented with solutions rather than problems, so Noah knew he had to come up with something before the 3 brothers spoke again. Mark wouldn't want to be bothered with details when he had so much else on his plate. Noah didn't live close enough to Lower Brambleton to supervise the work, and although he could check in remotely, there were always risks involved with being hands-off. And what if, as was so often the case with old places like Jack's, when the work started, other issues arose? If the roof timbers were starting to rot, that could easily be a few more thousand on the price of removing the foam. Ditto the electrics. As Noah walked the neat path through the park, he was sharply reminded of the contrast between London life and life in Lower Brambleton. He loved London and always would, but the closely cropped grass in the park, The weedless flower beds, the crowds of children all vying to get on the play equipment while their parents sipped lattes and looked at their phones, made even this patch of greenery feel crowded. After his visit to the cottage shortly after his grandfather's funeral, he'd begun to realize how much he missed being in the countryside. It had been a welcome break from school and university in his teens, and then his visits had got shorter and less frequent once he'd started working. By the time he'd established Noah Hathaway Estates, and all of the endless hours that had entailed, he was beginning to lose touch with what life was like outside the capital. Being back there had reminded him how much he enjoyed open air and countryside. It was just as well, he thought with a frown, as he revisited the contents of the email from the surveyor. One way or the other, it looked as though he was going to have to spend a lot more time in Lower Brambleton than he'd initially thought. Chapter 4. Noah travelled west, fighting the inevitable Friday afternoon traffic on the M25 and out to the moderately less hectic M4 and M5 that would eventually give way to smaller roads leading to the even smaller village of Lower Brambleton. As he drove, he mulled over the information that the surveyor had sent him. He had contacts for a lot of tradespeople in the London area, but he'd have to rely on local recommendations to find someone who'd be able to work on his grandfather's cottage. He added that to the list of things he'd need to look into once he was in situ. Eventually, Noah turned right into a tree-lined lane that would bring him into the east side of the village. The Observatory Field housing development, a recent addition to the village, was visible atop the long, flat expanse of land that looked down onto the centre of Lower Brambleton. The centre of the village itself was a cosy, welcoming place, with large tubs of flowers outside the small row of shops that provided a vibrant splash of colour. The shops themselves, a minuscule village store and post office, a charming charity shop, and an even smaller tea room were all housed in red brick buildings that looked the epitome of an English country rural idyll. Driving past the pub, the Star and Telescope, Noah was pleased to see that it was busy, with people sitting on the benches outside its door, and the faint sound of music emanating from the bar. Hanging baskets and tubs stuffed with geraniums and violas gave the pub a vibrant air, and Noah felt some of the tension draining out of his shoulders after the long drive, knowing he'd soon be at the cottage. A couple of minutes later, when he arrived, though, his hands involuntarily clenched on the steering wheel. Set at the left-hand side at the end of a terrace of 4 stone cottages that had once belonged to railway workers at the turn of the last century, the low-walled front garden looked tangled and wild. The windows were showing signs of grime, and as he parked up, pulled his leather weekend hold-all out of the boot of his Tesla and pushed open the wrought-iron gate that led to the front door, it gave a raucous squeak. It had only been 8 months since his grandfather had moved into the nursing home to live out his last days, and 4 months since his death, but the house looked as though it had lain unloved for far longer. How quickly things had deteriorated with no one to keep an eye on them. Noah paused on the doorstep, assailed by guilt at not coming back to check on the cottage sooner, and the painful knowledge that when he entered, Grandpa Jack wouldn't be there to welcome him. Shaking his head in frustration, he pulled the key out of his jeans pocket and swiftly let himself in. It felt like ripping off a plaster. The cottage smelt musty, the air still and quiet. There were lighter patches on the hall walls where he and his brothers had taken down the rogues gallery of family photographs that Jack had always kept there. His share of them were in a cardboard box in his flat, waiting to be reframed with something more in keeping with his own tastes. In the past, Jack had stood at the door, a welcoming smile on his face, while Monty, the irascible Bengal, yowled more of a warning than a welcome. Noah found he even missed that sound now. But he didn't have time to be maudlin. It was already nearly 8 o'clock, and Noah had left London without thinking about what he was going to do for food when he got here. He hadn't even brought any coffee with him for the morning. Dumping his bag in the hallway, he took a quick look around the downstairs of the cottage and switched the fridge back on. Thankfully, the door had been left ajar so it hadn't gone mouldy. The place was emptier and a lot sadder than it had been, but it would do for a night or two while he got to grips with what needed to be done. But as his stomach rumbled, what needed to be done immediately was find dinner. He tucked his phone into the back pocket of his jeans and pulled the keys back out of the front door where he'd left them when he'd walked in. He'd had some good meals at the Star and Telescope and hoped tonight would be no exception. A short time later, he was enjoying the short walk to the pub, past the small bank of shops that he was always astounded could survive in such a small village. The centerpiece of the row was Purrfect Paws, the charity shop that was linked to Monty's current place of residence. The window looked bright and appealing, and Noah was surprised at how well curated it was. He felt a pang, though, as he saw a couple of discreetly positioned posters advertising some of their cats currently up for adoption. It made him think of Monty. Pushing that thought firmly to one side, he continued walking. As he walked into the pub and approached the bar, a cheerful voice broke into Noah's thoughts. "What can I get you?" "A pint of Carter's cider, please," Noah replied. He plopped his phone and wallet down on the bar and let out a long breath. "Long day." Noah, who was about to start checking his messages, glanced back up at the bartender, who had a rather startling bright red dye job on her long hair, and held his gaze with direct, clear blue eyes. He gave a brief nod. "You could say that." "Well, there's nothing a pint or two won't fix." Noah grunted noncommittally. He had the feeling that not even the amber nectar of a decent pint of Somerset cider could do much to improve his current rather upsetting situation. But the last person he wanted to get into that with was a stranger behind the bar. All the same, as she finished pulling his pint and handed it to him, gesturing with her other hand at the contactless payment terminal to his left, he couldn't help noticing what a welcoming smile she had. He figured it was par for the course in a pub that relied so heavily on not just local trade but that of tourists, but it was still a nice smile. He'd been so used to the hurly-burly and hectic nature of buying drinks in London that he'd forgotten how the slower pace of the countryside also meant that people were more prepared to spend time talking to you while they prepared your order. "So, what brings you to the Star and Telescope tonight?" "Dinner, mainly," Noah replied. He glanced at the blackboard behind the bar, and his stomach gave another anticipatory rumble at the many choices. He had not had much of an appetite all week. Stress tended to do that to him, and he knew that he'd been winding himself up about coming back here and sorting out his grandfather's house. However, now that the drive was over, and he'd got over the first hurdle of letting himself into the house, some of the tension had started to dissipate. "Well, there's plenty of good options, as I'm sure you can see. Let me know what you want when you're ready, and I can sort you out a table." "Will do." Noah looked at the board for longer, but for all of his appetite he couldn't decide. His grandfather always used to laugh at him for not being able to make menu choices. He'd often dined here with him, and he wondered if the phantom of his grandfather would be a help or a hindrance tonight. Mulling things over, he finally glanced down at his phone and briefly checked his work emails, but nothing had come in since he left that afternoon. He wasn't surprised. The last week of July was often slow. People were more interested in going on holiday than they were in selling their houses. All the same, he couldn't help a slight sense of disquiet that no one had been in touch. He'd have to chase up a couple of leads when he got back on Monday morning. "Table for one?" The bartender broke into his thoughts. Yeah, thanks." He was still browsing his messages, but he wondered if he'd seen the bartender's left eyebrow give a little quirk. No matter. He'd dined alone plenty of times. He had the Kindle app on his phone and was more than happy at a table by himself. "Well, when you're ready, there's a table by the window in the bar, unless you want to sit in the restaurant." "The bar is fine," Noah replied. He was checking through his other messages and was only half paying attention. Realizing, though, that he was being rude, he exited his message app and put his phone down on the bar. Smiling apologetically, he looked at the bartender again properly for the first time since she'd served him his pint, noticing the rather jaunty duck-egg blue ribbon that kept the ends of her braided long red hair out of the way. She was wearing a striped Matelot jersey and form-fitting dark blue cropped jeans, and she looked to be about his age, give or take. The name badge pinned on her chest read Bella. Noah took a long pull of his pint. It was cool and delicious, with a sweet yet tart flavour that spoke of 4 generations of apple-growing excellence and expertise. He never drank cider when he was in the city, far preferring a German lager or a decent glass of red. But it only seemed fitting to raise a glass of cider in his grandfather's memory. The old boy considered himself a bit of a cider aficionado, and while he had always grumbled about the way the brew had changed over the years, far preferring a decent pint of the roughest scrumpy he could find, Noah felt that a pint of Carter's Gold was a fitting substitute. As he took another sip from the glass, he finally felt himself starting to relax. There was a lull inside the pub, since so many people were taking advantage of the fine weather and sitting outside. Bella was clearly at a bit of a loose end and hovered close by, watching the door for any customers coming in from the garden. "You look like you needed that," she observed, as he put his glass down on the bar. "Long drive." "Ah, I didn't think you were a local. Down for the holidays?" Noah knew that she was just being friendly, but he wasn't in the mood for a long discussion as to why he was in Lower Brambleton. He was never one to spill his guts to strangers, and that old cliché about hairdressers and bartenders being like priests in the confessional was one he'd never subscribed to. "Sort of," he said evasively. "Only here for the weekend, and then back to work on Monday." "Oh, holiday home, is it?" He was sure he wasn't imagining the slight edge to her voice as she said that. In his business, he knew enough to know that dyed-in-the-wool locals in places like this were not overly fond of people who came into villages, especially in the West Country, and spent their all-too-readily disposable income on a rural bolt-hole for weekends and a couple of weeks during the summer. He sold enough of them to people who tired of London to feel somewhat guilty by association. Not a holiday home, he conceded, not wanting to rock the boat so early on in his stay. That was likely to happen when he put his grandfather's house on the market anyway, because in all likelihood it would end up as a second home or an Airbnb. Unfortunately, being an Airbnb was Bella's second guess. Noah was too hungry, and he'd had too long a day to get into it with her, though. He merely muttered something non-committal and decided to head to his table. A short time later, having ordered locally reared beef in the form of a generous rump steak with all the trimmings, Noah sat back and waited for his food. He had tried to read a book on his Kindle app, but found he didn't have the head for it this evening. He didn't want to spend his time staring at his phone. A couple more people had come in while he'd been sitting there waiting for his food, and he saw Bella smiling at them. He observed her serving them for a moment or two, and found that his eyes were being drawn back to her, even as the waitress arrived with his meal. He wondered what her deal was. He couldn't place her accent. Not local, she lacked the rounded vowels of a Somerset native, but not giving away any other region either. He had the tendency to people-watch when he dined alone, and because inside the pub was so quiet, Bella was his main focus. She had the expertise of someone who had been doing her job for a while, and her warm smile and easy banter with the patrons suggested that they also knew her well. Her voice had a melodious quality that he found himself tuning into even as he tucked into his steak and chips, and he couldn't help listening in to the conversations she was having as people approached the bar to order drinks. A short time later, having finished his steak and ordered another pint, he sat back in his chair, ready to work out what it was he needed to get straight before he headed back to London on Sunday night. There was no time to waste. He didn't anticipate keeping much more stuff from the house, but the furniture was still there, and a fair amount of clutter of little value. There was no point in holding on to the past when the person who was the anchor to it had gone. All the same, doing the final house clearance was a task he wasn't exactly looking forward to. And then, of course, there was the other problem. The bills for the cattery were mounting, and he needed to make a decision about what was going to happen to Monty in the future. Noah faced quite the dilemma about what to do with the cat, but that was a job for tomorrow. As he was finishing up his cider, he tuned into Bella's conversation with another one of the locals. "I heard none of them have been near the place since Jack Hathaway died. I mean, if that was me and it was my granddad, I'd want to make sure that everything was shipshape as soon as possible. It seems disrespectful to leave things hanging around like that." Noah's heart thumped hard in his chest. "Yeah, but I heard the eldest grandson is some high-powered estate agent in London. Probably won't even bother coming to see the place before he puts it on the market. I bet he's got loads of contacts who can sort it out for him, and he won't even have to leave the city." "I think it's a real shame, though." Bella's voice was carrying clearly across the bar. "I mean, it's not only about the house. Molly says they haven't even been in touch about poor old Monty, apart from the odd email and paying the bills. Imagine leaving a cat in boarding for all that time and not even bothering to check in and see how he was." "People like that don't care," the other person, a rather rotund man in his late 20s, replied. "I mean, it's all just an inconvenience, isn't it? All they want to do is sell up and get the money." "It's just not right," Bella insisted. "Jack loved that place, and he loved Monty, and poor Monty is pining away without him." Noah had heard enough. Popping a couple of pound coins on his table as a tip for the waitress, he headed to the bar. "Can I pay the bill, please?" Even to his ears, his tone sounded terse. Bella glanced at him with that same welcoming smile she'd given him as he'd arrived. "Of course," she said. "Was everything to your liking?" "The food was fine," Noah replied shortly. "I could have done without hearing the gossip, though." Not waiting for Bella to reply, he waved his card at the contactless terminal and strode out of the pub. Chapter 5. By the time Bella left the Star and Telescope that evening, her feet were sore, and she was looking forward to her bed. She didn't mind working 2 jobs. She loved working at the cattery. She liked nothing better than helping the often terribly traumatized cats, nursing them back to health, and then seeing them off to their forever homes afterwards. Molly, bless her soul, couldn't afford to pay much above minimum wage, with the running costs of the cattery being so huge and being so reliant on donations from the public. Molly had asked her more than once whether she thought she would ever move on from Purrfect Paws, but for the moment Bella was content to pour all of her love into the waifs and strays that were brought to the Cattery and Rescue Centre. Painful experience had taught her that human relationships didn't often carry the same rewards. Bella thought back to the abrupt response of that attractive male customer that evening. What was it to him if she and some of the locals were having a chat? The pub was a hub for the villagers, and it was inevitable that conversations would be had about their neighbours. She wondered what his deal was. He'd been quite cagey about his reasons for being in Lower Brambleton, when all she'd been doing was trying to make conversation and put him at ease. Something she'd been talking about with one of the regular patrons, Will, had obviously hit a nerve with him. Mind you, she thought, he was only around for the weekend. What did it matter? She kept trying to tell herself that as she walked the short distance from the pub to the tiny cottage she shared with Marika. "Hiya," she called as she let herself in through the red-painted wooden front door of the cottage. Marika was a night owl and often didn't go to bed until the early hours of the morning, so her being up when Bella finished her shift at the Star and Telescope was no great surprise. Bella often wondered how Marika managed to burn the candle at both ends, given that her job as a solicitor in Taunton often meant intense meetings and long office hours, but Marika seemed to manage it. "Hey, babe," Marika called from the lounge. "How was your shift?" "Fine, but I got the rough end of some bloke's tongue at the end of the night." Marika raised a suggestive eyebrow. "In a good way?" Laughing despite herself, Bella shook her head. "I wish. No, unfortunately, he was the sexy but grumpy type. Fuck knows what upset him, but he harumphed out of the place once he paid his bill, with a right look on his face. I reckon he was only a tourist, though, so I'm not too bothered. They're so up themselves, these people who come into the village, and expect it to be all hearts, flowers, and chocolate boxes. Well, I wouldn't think any more of it." Marika gestured to the bottle of Jack Daniels that was sitting on the coffee table in front of her. "Nightcap?" "You shouldn't drink alone. It's not good for you." Marika gave a grin. "What makes you think I was alone?" Bella wrinkled her nose. "Don't tell me. I'm your post-shag conversation. At least tell me he's not still upstairs." "Nope," Marika said. "You know the cat fur you bring home makes him sneeze. And he's got an early start tomorrow." Bella giggled. "There are such things as antihistamines, you know." "Oh, you know Gerard. Until we can make it official, he's going to keep on going home." Bella felt a sense of disquiet. Although Marika hadn't intended that, she was sure. Her housemate come landlady had been making more noises about Gerard becoming a permanent fixture, and Bella knew that meant she would probably need to find somewhere else to live. Although Marika hadn't said as much, the cat hair allergy was a definite issue. Bella had the sense that change might be afoot. However, she told herself firmly, as Marika passed her a cut crystal tumbler of Jack Daniels, her friend wouldn't throw her out on her ear. She was a wonderful companion, and that wasn't her style. They'd met in Holland 3 years ago, when Bella had been temping in the office of the law firm where Marika had been working. A swift promotion to their UK office in the West Country had followed for the Dutch national, and when Bella had found herself in Somerset after coming back to the UK 12 months ago, Marika had offered her a temporary place to stay. The arrangement had been so pleasant that Bella had quickly become Marika's official lodger, and things had been calm and settled ever since. Even with the possibility of change, Bella was sure she'd have plenty of time to find somewhere new. "So, back to this good-looking, grumpy guy of yours?" Marika was looking expectantly at her now both glasses had been filled. "He's not mine." Bella had had what could charitably be called a dry spell. Since she'd come back to the UK, there hadn't been anyone serious, and she missed having someone in her life. Living in such a small village meant that there wasn't much of an opportunity to meet new people either. Her thoughts couldn't help drifting back to those strange, slightly stilted interactions with the mysterious guy in the pub tonight. She'd watched him out of the corner of her eye while he was eating dinner. As an attentive member of the pub staff, it was only reasonable to keep an eye on a customer and make sure that they were happy. But she'd be lying if she didn't admit to herself that her gaze was attracted over to his small table in the corner of the bar more than once, just because she'd been intrigued by him. Most people who came into the pub were all too happy to talk about why they were in Lower Brambleton. True, a lot of them were holiday-makers and were keen to share their enthusiasm and their thoughts about this most beautiful corner of Somerset, and a lot of them were friendly people looking for a bit of human connection, chasing that rural idyll of a country pub where everybody knew everybody else and exchanged pleasantries, and as kitsch as the Star and Telescope was, with its dark blue-painted ceiling, with the major constellations picked out in yellow, and the brass astronomical instruments adorning every nook, cranny and windowsill, it did have a certain peculiar, eccentric charm that various landlords over the years had tapped into to maximize profits and create a welcoming atmosphere. So she'd kept an eye on the mysterious customer, noting that he didn't take any calls and he didn't look at his phone all the time he was eating dinner. She couldn't quite put her finger on what it was that intrigued her about him. He was certainly attractive. The longish dark hair that was almost too long to be fashionable these days, and those melting chocolate brown eyes that had regarded her so seriously when they'd had that first conversation at the bar, had made her pulse beat faster. She shook her head ruefully. She'd admitted to herself that she was feeling the drought. It was no wonder that she was rather susceptible to the attractive looks of a handsome stranger. Of course, that had changed when he'd come over after his meal and been so abrupt with her. She couldn't help going back over that conversation in her head and wondering why his manner had changed so suddenly. Even if he hadn't been the type to share information about himself with a bartender, the sudden change of tone had felt uncalled for under the circumstances. "Put it out of your mind," she told herself firmly, as she took a sip of the rather generous measure of Jack Daniels that Marika had poured for her. She wasn't usually one for a nightcap after a shift at the pub, but tonight it felt welcome, and it took the edge off her racing thoughts and her aching feet. "Euro for your thoughts?" Marika teased, as Bella sank down onto the sofa next to her. "Not worth that much," Bella replied, "but it has been a long night." She grinned suddenly at her friend. "Although, as Gerard has already paid you a visit tonight, at least I won't be kept awake with your headboard banging against the wall." Marika threw her an appraising look. "Feeling frustrated, darling?" Bella didn't dignify that with a response, merely taking another sip of her bourbon. "Thanks for the nightcap, lovely," she said, putting the glass down on the coffee table again. "It was just what I needed." "I don't think so." Marika raised a perfectly shaped eyebrow in her direction. "I think you need something with a male name, but not a bottle of whiskey. How about we head into town at the weekend? I could dance and drink, and I think you could do with—" She trailed off and gave her suggestive laugh. "Well, you know." Bella grinned at her friend. "I'm pulling a double shift on Saturday at the pub. Got to pay the rent somehow." "Darling, you know you can always owe me the rent." "I know, and I love you for it. But you have to let me stand on my own 2 feet. "It's your feet I'm worried about. It can't do you any good standing behind that bar all night." "I'll live." Bella leaned forward and kissed Marika on the cheek. "Don't stay up too late. It's not good for you either." "Good night, darling." "Good night." As Bella ascended the narrow, steep staircase to her bedroom, she found herself for the first time in a long while wondering if this was going to be it for the rest of her life. She had always felt contented with her lot, but she was beginning to realize that her lot didn't consist of, well, a lot. It was probably the Jack Daniels talking, she figured. Shaking her head wearily, she just about managed to brush her teeth before falling into bed and into a dreamless, heavy sleep. Chapter 6. In contrast, Noah did not spend a peaceful night. It was partly due to the fact that he was sleeping in the same single bed that had been in his grandfather's spare room for the past 25 years. It was a foot too short for him, and about 6 inches too narrow, and he only just managed to save himself from falling out and hitting the varnished